Cher is one of the rare icons in American history who seemed to defeat time itself, but even she could not defeat the pain running through her own blood. For nearly 60 years, the world watched her do what almost no entertainer could do. She survived poverty. She escaped powerful men who tried to control her life. She turned wounds into music, loneliness into glamour, and heartbreak into an empire of glittering gowns, Oscar glory, and standing ovations. To millions, Cher looked untouchable, a woman who had conquered every era that tried to erase her. But behind the closed doors of courtrooms, family crises, and private rooms the cameras were never meant to see, another story was unfolding. The woman who broke every cage built around her own life was now facing the one cage she could not break, the suffering of her own son. At nearly 80 years old, the ultimate survivor found herself in the cruelest position of all, powerful enough to command the world, yet powerless to stop the pain inside her own family. This is the hidden cost of being a legend. Before the world called Cher a goddess, before the black hair, the impossible cheekbones, the Bob Mackie gowns glittering beneath television lights, before Hollywood transformed her into something larger than celebrity itself, she was simply a little girl named Cherilyn Sarkeesian, trying to understand why love in her world always seemed temporary. And maybe that is the first thing people misunderstand about legends. They imagine greatness begins with confidence. It rarely does. Sometimes greatness begins with abandonment. Sometimes it begins with instability so severe that survival itself becomes a kind of intelligence. Cher was born into post-war America, but there was nothing glamorous about the beginning of her story. No safety, no emotional security, no stable home waiting to protect her from the chaos of adulthood. Her mother, Georgia Holt, was beautiful, talented, charismatic, the kind of woman who could walk into a room and make people stare without even trying. But beauty does not protect people from poverty, and talent does not always save women from the men who damage them. Georgia herself had grown up carrying scars long before Cher was ever born. A father obsessed with pushing her towards stardom. A childhood spent singing in bars instead of living like a normal little girl. Men drifting in and out of her life. Financial instability constantly hanging over everything like weather that never fully cleared. By the time Cher entered the world in 1946, her mother was already exhausted by survival. And survival has a way of forcing impossible decisions onto women with no power. There was a moment, long before fame, long before the music, long before America memorized Cher's face, when her existence almost ended before it even began. Georgia had been pressured to terminate the pregnancy. People around her believed another child would destroy what little stability remained in her life. The message was simple. This baby would become a burden. But something inside Georgia refused to surrender completely. She walked away from the clinic. And that single decision altered American cultural history forever. Yet survival did not magically become easier afterward. Money disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. Relationships collapsed. Fear consumed the household. Eventually, with almost nothing left, Georgia and Cher's father made the devastating decision to place infant Cher inside a Catholic orphanage temporarily because they could no longer afford to care for her themselves. That wound would never fully leave her. People often talk about childhood trauma like a dramatic explosion, but sometimes it enters quietly. A hallway, a strange room, adults disappearing without explanation. A child learning too early that people you love can leave at any moment. Years later, Cher would still speak about that period with a kind of emotional ache that never completely healed. Because deep down, abandoned children rarely stop fearing abandonment. They simply become better at hiding it. But here is the strange paradox that makes Cher's story feel almost mythological. The same instability that wounded her also forged her. She learned early how to read people emotionally, learned how to survive uncertainty, learned how to become emotionally self-reliant long before she should have needed to. Even as a teenager, there was already something unusual about her presence. She did not resemble the polished blonde femininity America celebrated during the 1950s and early 1960s. She looked different, taller, darker, sharper. ethnic in a country still uncomfortable with women who looked too unconventional. But sometimes what makes a person feel alienated in youth later becomes the exact thing that makes them unforgettable. And Cher became unforgettable. Not because she tried to fit inside the American dream, but because she looked like someone who had already survived outside it. By the mid-1960s, the young girl who once cried inside cold institutional walls was about to enter another kind of institution entirely: fame. And waiting for her, there was a man nearly 11 years older than her who would change her life forever. Not only by helping create one of the most recognizable entertainment empires of the 20th century, but by quietly constructing a cage around her so sophisticated that millions of people watching from home would mistake it for love. When Cher first met Sonny Bono in Los Angeles, she was only 16 years old, young, ambitious, emotionally exposed, and still carrying the quiet fear of being left behind again. Sonny was older, confident, already connected to the music business, and to Cher, he seemed like someone who understood the world before she did. That kind of certainty can feel irresistible to a teenager searching for stability. At first, their relationship looked almost cinematic. Two outsiders building a career together during the chaos and freedom of the 1960s counterculture era. He was awkward, sarcastic, unconventional. She was striking, mysterious, impossible to ignore. Together, they looked different from every polished celebrity couple America was used to seeing, and audiences loved them for it. They did not feel manufactured, they felt real. But fame has a dangerous way of turning performance into reality. By the end of the 1960s, Sonny and Cher were no longer just musicians. They were a television phenomenon. Their songs dominated radio stations. Their variety show became one of the biggest hits in America. Every week, millions watched Cher stand beneath bright studio lights in elaborate gowns, delivering punchlines with perfect timing while looking completely untouchable. Publicly, she seemed powerful. Privately, she later admitted something that changed the way many people viewed that era forever. "I never made one decision by myself." Behind the success, Sonny controlled nearly every part of their empire. The contracts, the finances, the business deals, the schedule, even parts of her public image. At the time, Cher believed that was simply what love looked like. Since childhood, she had learned to associate love with dependence, adaptation, and sacrifice. Years later, she revealed that despite earning millions of dollars, she barely understood how the money around her even worked. One of the most recognizable women in America was living inside a machine built around her own identity while owning very little of it herself. And perhaps the most unsettling part was that she did not recognize the trap immediately because it felt emotionally familiar. Sonny did not control her through rage or public humiliation. His control was quieter, structural, psychological. He made himself feel necessary to every part of her life, and the more successful they became, the harder it became for Cher to separate loyalty from submission. America saw Sonny as the mastermind and Cher as the glamorous star he created. But beneath the success, small cracks had already started forming. Small moments where she began realizing her life no longer fully belonged to her. She later described feeling detached from herself during that period, as though she were living inside someone else's script. "I was living Sonny's dream," she admitted years later, not her own. And eventually, the illusion collapsed completely. During the breakdown of their marriage in the early 1970s, Cher discovered how little legal control she actually had over the empire carrying her name. Sonny controlled the companies, the finances, and most of the contracts connected to her work. She later described the realization as like a kick in the stomach, not just betrayal, ownership. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "You work for Sonny," he reportedly told her. "You have nothing." In that moment, the glamorous fantasy America had watched for years suddenly revealed something far colder underneath it. But something inside Cher had already started changing. The frightened girl searching for protection was slowly becoming a woman beginning to recognize her own power. And once someone finally sees the cage clearly, it becomes impossible to pretend it is still freedom. By the time Cher finally separated from Sonny Bono, the world read it as a clean victory, freedom regained, a television icon stepping out of control and into independence. But real life rarely resets that neatly, especially for people who have spent years confusing emotional intensity with love. Almost immediately after that breakup, Cher entered another relationship that would pull her into an entirely different form of collapse. Greg Allman was the opposite of Sonny in every visible way. Less control, more chaos. Less structure, more instability. He carried the worn, distant aura of a man already shaped by loss. Fame had not elevated him so much as it had hollowed him. His brother Dwayne Allman was gone. Friends had disappeared. Substances filled the spaces where stability should have been. In that environment, life stopped moving in straight lines and started dissolving into repetition. What drew Cher toward him was not logic, but recognition. The kind of recognition that happens when two people mistake familiarity in pain for safety. Years later, she described it with striking clarity. I loved him because he was sweet and kind when he was sober. The emphasis sits on one fragile condition. When? Not always. Only in brief moments when he returned to himself. Their relationship accelerated with almost no distance between chapters. Shortly after her divorce, Cher married Greg in 1975. From the outside, it looked impulsive. From the inside, it felt like escape. A way to prove that love still existed beyond control. But reality arrived quickly. Within days, she understood the severity of his addiction. The marriage collapsed almost immediately in practice, even if the emotional ties did not. Still, she did not fully detach, because by then, something deeper had taken hold. The belief that love meant repair. That brokenness was something devotion could fix. Greg became not just a partner, but a responsibility she tried to stabilize. Rehabilitation, attempts at structure, efforts to rebuild a family inside instability. For brief periods, there were signs of balance. Their son, Elijah Blue Allman, was born in 1976. And sometimes Greg appeared present again, almost like a different version of himself, temporarily resurfacing. But addiction does not hold shape. It cycles. It fades and returns without warning. And each return erases whatever stability had briefly formed. The home became unpredictable not through drama alone, but through erosion of consistency itself. Cher understood his pain deeply, which made distance harder to create. Walking away did not feel like leaving a partner. It felt like abandoning someone already broken long before she arrived. But eventually, survival redefined the boundary. One night, during a severe paranoid episode, Greg became convinced there were threats outside the home. Fear escalated into full psychological collapse. In that moment, the situation stopped being emotional and became immediate. Years later, Cher reduced the decision to its simplest form. I couldn't risk my children. No justification layered on top of it. Just protection overriding everything else. That sentence carries the entire weight of adult relationships under pressure. Love can exist fully and still not be enough to sustain safety. She did not leave because understanding disappeared, but because understanding alone could not change the reality unfolding in front of her. Yet, even after separation, the emotional imprint remained. Greg represented more than a failed marriage. He reflected a pattern she had not yet fully named, the tendency to try to heal others in places where she had once been hurt herself. And that realization, more than the breakup itself, left a lasting fracture. By the end of the 1970s, two marriages had ended in different forms of instability, one shaped by control, one shaped by collapse. Publicly, life continued to move forward. Privately, the emotional structures around family were already weakening in ways no one could yet see. There is something unsettling about how pain moves through generations without ever announcing itself. It does not repeat as a copy, it mutates. And by the late 1970s, Cher was unknowingly standing inside a version of the same emotional landscape she once tried to escape. Publicly, everything looked like a scent. Her records still sold. Hollywood had changed its tone toward her. Directors who once dismissed her as a pop figure now saw something harder to ignore. Presence, intelligence, and a kind of emotional truth that could not be manufactured. She was no longer being reinvented by others. She was reinventing herself in real time. But survival always carries a hidden cost, especially for someone who has to rebuild a life again and again while still performing stability for the world. Her days became a loop of tours, sets, interviews, and negotiations, each one demanding a different version of the same persona. Fame does not pause once it decides you are useful. And somewhere outside the spotlight, Elijah Blue Allman was growing up inside that rhythm, absorbing it without language, without explanation, without a clear place to put what he felt. Cher told herself she was protecting him. That is often how it begins for parents in unstable systems. Protection becomes distance. Distance becomes routine. So Elijah was sent away to boarding schools at an age when most children still measure safety through voices at night and the sound of familiar doors opening. Years later, he would describe it without anger, almost quietly, as if stating something already decided long ago. When you're sent away at 7 years old, it's hard not to feel rejected, not explained, not interpreted, just felt. Because a child does not translate absence into circumstance. He translates it into meaning. Not my mother is working, but I was not enough to stay for. And that interpretation, once formed, does not easily dissolve. The irony is that Cher once stood inside a different version of that same feeling. Inside a Catholic orphanage, asking a question she never fully forgot how to ask. The setting changed. The emotional logic did not. And what often passes unnoticed in stories like this is how easily survival begins to look like function. Cher kept moving, work expanded, reinvention accelerated. There was always another project, another schedule, another version of herself that needed to exist. Stillness was never neutral. Stillness allowed memory to surface, so she stayed in motion. And it worked, at least on the surface. By the 1980s, she had become something rare in entertainment. A second career that did not feel like nostalgia. In films like Silkwood and later Mask, something shifted in how audiences saw her. The glamour remained, but it no longer defined her. What came through instead was strain, restraint, and an emotional clarity that could not be taught. She was not performing pain anymore. She was recognizing it. And that recognition changed everything. Viewers did not see a fantasy figure. They saw endurance shaped into performance. But inside her private world, the structure was not stabilizing in the same way. The distance between her and her children was becoming its own quiet presence in the house. Not dramatic, not declared, just accumulating over time. Elijah grew up inside that absence, carrying feelings he did not yet have the language to organize. And as the years passed, the truth became harder to avoid. Even when love is present, it does not always arrive in the form a child can recognize. And sometimes, what a parent builds to prevent loss becomes the very shape that loss takes. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Cher had already lived several lives inside a single lifetime. She had moved through poverty, public humiliation, controlling relationships, addiction circling her family, and the machinery of fame at its most unforgiving. Yet none of it prepared her for the quiet emotional rupture that came through her oldest child. Chastity Bono had once existed in the public imagination as a symbol rather than a person. On the Sonny and Cher Comedy Hour, she appeared beside her parents as a child the audience thought they understood, a living extension of a carefully constructed family image. Innocence, continuity, a story that seemed complete from the outside. But identity does not follow public narratives. It develops in silence, away from expectation. As Chastity grew older, something within that image began to shift. First came the realization of being gay. Later came a transformation far more profound, living as Chaz Bono. By then, the cultural environment surrounding gender identity was still rigid, often unkind, and deeply unforgiving in ways that are difficult to separate from the time itself. Inside that context, Cher's reaction was not simple acceptance or rejection. It was disorientation. She did not mask that truth. She described fear without softening it, confusion without packaging it, and a kind of emotional grief she struggled to articulate without reducing her child into language that felt inadequate. Not the loss of a person, but the loss of a future she had once imagined with certainty. Over time, that emotional landscape shifted. Slowly, unevenly, without a single defining moment. Cher began to recognize that what she was witnessing was not disappearance, but continuation in another form. Chaz did not require correction or resistance. He required space to exist without distortion. And at some point, Cher made a choice many parents never fully reach. She allowed her understanding of love to expand beyond expectation. When she spoke about her child later, her language lost its public weight. It became simple. I love my child. No framing, no defense, no performance, just recognition. That simplicity carried its own force because the world around them had turned identity into debate, while the private reality remained something far more intimate. A mother learning, slowly, how to separate fear from love. There is also something revealing in how Cher moved through this period. Unlike many public figures who spend later life protecting the stability of their image, she remained willing to revise her own understanding in real time, even when it left her exposed to misunderstanding. That openness did not protect her reputation, but it kept her emotionally present in a way that outlived trends and eras. Still, while one part of her life was being redefined through understanding, another was quietly collapsing. Elsewhere in the family, Elijah Blue Allman was moving deeper into addiction and instability, his life unraveling in ways that could no longer be contained by distance or time. And with that, Cher found herself facing a question that had no clean answer. How far can love go before it begins to blur into control? And what remains of a parent when protection itself becomes a form of danger? By the time Cher entered her 70s, most people assumed the battles of her life had already settled into legend. Publicly, she looked untouchable again. Not just a singer, not just an actress, but one of the rare American icons who had outlived the eras that created her. She had survived reinvention after reinvention, industry dismissal, public humiliation, controlling men, broken marriages, and the machinery of fame itself. But longevity does not protect a mother from the oldest terror in the world. Watching a child drift toward danger and not knowing how to reach him. Around 2022, Cher was confronted with a crisis that made every previous victory feel distant. Elijah Blue Allman, her son with Greg Allman, had struggled for years, and reports around his condition began moving from private concern into public view. Substance-related struggles and mental health concerns were described in legal filings and media reports. Photographs and headlines placed him near the Shadow Merriman, one of Hollywood's most symbolic backdrops for fame unraveling in public. For Cher, this was not gossip. It was not another tabloid cycle. It was a mother nearing 80, reading documents, seeing images, hearing reports, and fearing the phone call every parent dreads. The pain carried an old echo. Cher had already loved a man consumed by addiction in Greg Allman. She had already seen how chaos can move through a family. Not as one isolated storm, but as a pattern that returns in another generation wearing a different face. Now she was not watching it approach a husband. She was watching it approach her child. That difference changes everything. Love becomes fear. Fear becomes urgency. Urgency begins to look from the outside like control. The situation became even more painful when Elijah's wife, Maria Angela King, accused Cher of arranging to have him removed from a hotel room during an attempted intervention. The word kidnapping moved quickly through headlines, the kind of word that turns private panic into public spectacle. Cher denied the allegation. But beneath the legal language and competing narratives was something simpler and more devastating. She was afraid of losing him, afraid that waiting would become regret, afraid that stepping in too hard might wound him further, afraid that doing nothing might leave her with the one outcome she could not survive. She later pursued a legal conservatorship, arguing that Elijah was unable to manage his well-being and finances because of serious mental health and substance-related concerns. Public reaction split almost immediately. Some saw a mother trying to save her son. Others saw control, especially in a culture still haunted by other famous conservatorship battles. And this is where Cher's story becomes painfully complicated. She had once lived on the other side of control. Contracts she did not understand. Decisions made without her. Autonomy taken from her under the language of protection. Now, decades later, she found herself reaching toward legal authority not to escape control, but to prevent what she feared might become a different kind of loss. There is no clean moral shape to that position. Too little intervention can look like abandonment. Too much intervention can become another cage. Every choice is contaminated by fear. In 2024, Cher reportedly ended her conservatorship effort after a private agreement, but the emotional question did not disappear with a legal filing. Later, in 2026, reports indicated that another attempt to secure urgent court intervention was denied, with the judge finding there was not enough immediate evidence to justify emergency action. A reminder that even the legal system could not give Cher the certainty she was searching for. Because courtrooms can close a case, they cannot close a mother's fear. And whether the public judged her as protective or controlling, the human reality remained harder than any headline could hold. Cher was trying, in the only ways she could still imagine, to stop her son from disappearing. That is why this chapter cuts so deeply. The woman who spent her life breaking cages was now being forced to ask whether a cage could ever become a form of protection. The girl who had once feared abandonment had become the mother terrified of losing a child she could not fully reach. And while the struggle unfolded in public, another ending was already forming quietly in the background. The woman who shaped the beginning of Cher's story, her mother, Georgia Holt, was approaching the end of hers. By late 2022, while Cher was already carrying the public fear surrounding Elijah, another kind of loss was forming quietly at the center of her life. Georgia Holt, her mother, her origin point, the first emotional structure she had ever known, was dying. To the public, Georgia had always seemed almost unbreakable. Striking in old age, quick-witted, sharp-tongued, and stubborn in the same way her daughter would later become famous for. But Georgia's life had never been easy. She had grown up through scarcity, family instability, broken relationships, financial pressure, and the long disappointment of an entertainment industry that kept letting doors almost open. Before Cher ever became Cher, Georgia had already carried her own unfinished dream. Beauty, ambition, a voice, and a lifetime spent near the edge of a stage that never fully belonged to her. Cher understood that inheritance more deeply than most people realized. At one point, she said with devastating simplicity, "I took my mother's dreams and made them happen." That sentence reframes the awards, the reinventions, the longevity, not as pure self-creation, but as continuation. Cher was not only building her own life, she was carrying forward the life Georgia had been denied. So, when Georgia's health declined, the loss was not just personal, it was structural. Cher described watching her mother move between moments of clarity and physical collapse, the body weakening while awareness remained painfully present. At one point, Georgia's heart stopped during transport to the hospital. By the time they arrived, the ending had already become irreversible. Cher did not dress it in mythology. She simply said, "We let her go." She wasn't in pain anymore. Georgia Holt died in December 2022 at 96. For the first time, Cher existed without the woman who had been there before language, before fame, before the world ever gave her a name to perform under. The woman who once refused to end the pregnancy. The woman who had been forced to place her daughter in a Catholic orphanage, then returned every day because leaving completely was never what she wanted. The woman whose unfinished ambitions quietly became the foundation of a global career. Grief did not arrive as spectacle. It arrived as a missing center. Even at the height of her fame, Cher had still been someone's daughter. Now that role had nowhere to go. She described her mother as free, and perhaps that was true. But freedom for the dying often leaves the living with a room they do not know how to stand in. And while that chapter closed quietly, another older force was beginning to surface again. Sonny, ownership, and the unfinished business of a life Cher had spent decades trying to reclaim. Most people assumed the story between Cher and Sonny Bono ended the day he died in 1998. But systems of power rarely end with the people who created them. Long before that, Cher had already lived through a marriage where she discovered she legally owned almost nothing tied to the success built from her own voice, image, and labor. When she left, it was not with victory, but with separation. Just enough distance to reclaim herself. For a time, that chapter appeared closed, absorbed into history. Then, years later, it resurfaced. Around 2021, Sonny, Bono's estate and associated music publishing entities moved to reclaim control over royalties from songs like I Got You Babe and The Beat Goes On, arguing that copyright law allowed inherited rights to be reassigned decades after the original arrangements. On paper, it was a legal dispute. In practice, it reopened something far older. For Cher, it did not feel like business continuity. It felt like repetition. The same structure, the same pressure, the same attempt to separate her from work that had helped define an era of American music and television. This time, however, the response was different. The woman who once signed contracts she could barely understand was no longer in that position. Cher pushed back directly, initiating legal action and asserting ownership over what she believed had never ceased to be hers. In 2024, the court ruled in her favor, affirming her rights to the royalties and ordering repayment of withheld sums. Outwardly, it was a financial resolution. Internally, it carried a different weight. It marked a reversal of a pattern that had defined much of her early career: control, loss, and delayed recognition. After decades shaped by dependency, manipulation, reinvention, and survival, she reached a point she could not have reached in the 1970s. She no longer negotiated her place inside the system that once contained her. She stood outside it, and it no longer had authority over her. Today, Cher no longer reads like a conventional celebrity. She feels closer to something time itself forgot to erase. A figure who has moved through entire eras of fame, collapse, reinvention, and recovery, and simply remained. The glamour is still visible, but it no longer stands alone. It sits alongside the marks of a life lived under constant exposure, being abandoned, controlled, exploited, and emotionally worn down by the very relationships that once defined her world. A child nearly lost before she entered it. A wife inside a marriage that shaped her career and limited her autonomy. A mother navigating addiction in one child while learning how to recognize a changing identity in another. And yet, through every version of that life, she never fully disappeared from it. That persistence is likely why her image resonates so strongly with older audiences. Not as perfection, but as continuity under pressure. The ability to remain intact through experiences that quietly dismantle others. Even now, the humor, the sharpness, the defiance that defined her public presence decades ago are still there. But they sit beneath a heavier awareness, the kind that comes from being seen, judged, and remembered across multiple generations at once. And in the end, what lingers is not just the fame itself, but what survived behind it. Not the reinventions, not the spectacle, but endurance. When you think of Cher, what remains most vivid? The music, the transformations, or the fact that she never truly vanished from her own story?